Good morning. If I could just ask everybody, please sit down. All right, thank you all for coming today. We appreciate it. If the show-stopping, racy title of this session, New York City and the 2020 Census, attracted you here to the Sheraton, it's because you know just how important the census is to New York. There's a lot riding for our city and state on this very simple form. The census determines our funding for literally dozens of federal programs, including Medicaid, Medicare, Transit, and Head Start. The census determines how many seats we have in the House, and New York is a real risk of losing a seat or two. And the census also shapes the electoral map. New York City and state needs an accurate count, but history has told us that is hard to get. ABNY would like to be helpful and would like to work with all of you to be helpful. Lately, more things feel out of our control. But the census and getting the census right is actually in our hands. And while it won't be easy, we can do this on our own together. Joe Salvo, the Chief Demographer for City Planning, will explain what's at stake and what's at risk and share the best path for getting the most New Yorkers counted. But first, before Joe takes the stage, it is my great honor to introduce Congressman Adriano Espaillat, who, as the representative of our 13th Congressional District, has long been a champion for New York and is part of a coalition of lawmakers demanding full funding for an accurate count. At the end of this month, on March 31st, we will find out if a citizenship question will be included in the survey. It is a seemingly bureaucratic detail, but it has big implications for undocumented New Yorkers. And it's something we should all care about because it can deter people from participating. There is no more appropriate person to talk about this than Congressman Espaillat, who made history as the first formally undocumented immigrant to serve in Congress. He is an inspiring advocate both for New York and for immigrant communities, and we are truly grateful to have him here today. Congressman.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everybody. Boy, I came from D.C. where they shut down for an inch of snow, and then I see that we just had a little bit more here, and apparently we shut down here too. Something is going on with New York. But thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all for being here today. This is an important issue that comes around every 10 years, right? And so this is a critical issue that is really a snapshot, right? A photo of who we are at a given time. And so it's extremely important because it gives you the demographics of New York State. It tells you how many women there are, how many men, how many African Americans, how many Latinos, within the Latinos, how many Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans, Colombians, Ecuadorians. It tells you the income brackets of our city. So it's really a great tool to understand who we are as a city and as a state. And it comes around, as I said, every year. But it also drives the allocation of $7 billion in federal funding to people that may need programs, education, healthcare, transportation, as well as food stamps, Medicaid, all Section 8, all these very important programs that help our city and help the neediest among us. So this is truly an important task. Traditionally, the census effort has been plagued with heavy undercounts. Traditionally, there have been hard to count communities in New York City and across the state. The district that I represent is a very diverse district. In fact, it has East Harlem, which is the cradle of the Hispanic, the Puerto Rican experience in New York, if not the country. It has iconic Harlem, which is the the capital of the African diaspora, not just in the United States, but probably across the world. It has immigrant Washington Heights, Hamilton Heights, Inwood. It has the Northwest Bronx. It goes all the way up to Meshulah Parkway, all the way up to Montefiore and Gun Hill Road, the Northwest Bronx. So it's got Albanians in Norwood. It's got West Africans in the Bronx, Puerto Ricans in the Bronx. It's got Vietnamese in University Heights, Russian Jews on Bennett Avenue, German Jews on Fort Washington Avenue, Dominicans in Washington Heights. It's got Senegalese in East Harlem, Mexicans in East Harlem. So it's such a rich district, a very diverse district, but it makes it hard to count. In the last census, we have one of the highest non-response rates in the state. But we wound up with one of the most accurate counts of the entire city of New York because we had the boots on the ground. We had the troops doing the old-fashioned door-to-door work. It was culturally sensitive, language sensitive, so that people that were hired from within the community, even non-citizens were hired to do the door knocks, so people knew who they were and they would open the door. The current census provides that you be a citizen to be able to do the door knock, this coming census. And so we were able to successfully get an excellent count for the state and the city of New York. And so we want to duplicate those efforts again. We have field offices. We have one field office. We plan to have that again. I spoke to the census director last night, and he told me that we will have less offices across the country, half the number of field offices across the country, but fortunately we'll have some of them in areas that are hard to count. And of course, this also determines the number of seats we have in Congress, in the House of Representatives. And we're looking potentially to lose a seat because of our loss of population. But if you have a severe undercount, we may lose 2 seats. And that obviously translates into our political power, our ability to get our voice in the House of Representatives heard. And this is important. And the problem is that the minorities have long been seriously undercounted. So for people Latinos and African Americans, Latinos have been undercounted by 1.5% and African Americans by 2%. You say, well, that's only 2%. Well, when you translate that into numbers, it's real huge numbers that very well may translate into losing a seat in Congress or losing all those important services that we're able to get through the census count. Now, yesterday we did an omnibus spending bill with lots of good stuff in it, right? It had funding for Amtrak, $541 million for Amtrak to be able to move forward with the Gateway project. It had funding to combat the opiated drug epidemic. It also had additional funding for a host of good things. Some housing monies that I was able to push through, but it did not have the dreamers in it, once again. So 800,000 young people and their parents are still left unprotected. They are still left out there in the cold with the possibility in the future of being deported. But it did have in it $2.8 billion for the census count and for the end of this year. And we're expecting and we're pushing for next year to have an additional $4.1 billion to ensure that we have full funding for the census and that we'll be able to apply that funding, those monies to get a very accurate count. So this is all very important, right, as we move forward, all very critical that we continue to push and you continue. I think you have a pivotal role, a very important role to play. So, well, I'm in the private, you may say, I'm in the private sector, I'm in a law firm. What do I have to do with this? Well, you not only can you get your lawyers to help out, but the maintenance people and the messengers and the people that work for you, you have the ability to get that message out in private sector America that this is truly important, that this is truly critical to ensure that we get an accurate count in the census. And if you study it really deeply, you will see how the last census, right, not only did it give us the numbers, but then those numbers that we see now in Pennsylvania and in Texas, when the courts have weighed in, were manipulated to draw a very skewed congressional district that favor one side of the aisle over the other. And there are two traditional sort of like strategies that have been used to prevent people from getting fair representation. One is cracking, where you crack a district in half and you prevent people from having a representative of their own community, right? And that happens all the time, where the Latino community is cracked in half, the African-American community, the Asian community, or packing, where you take everybody and you put them under one district and you prevent them from having potentially two representatives. So the courts had determined in Pennsylvania and in Texas that these districts were drawn unfairly, and they will have to be redrawn again before we even get to this next census. But that's all done, that all happens within the parameters of what happens in the census. And if our count is severely under the actual count, then that will further aggravate the lack of representation in Congress. So this is truly important for all of us to come together as a city to ensure that folks, the residents of the city of New York, get the services that they're entitled to, that federal government continues to be a partner in this endeavor. But for us to really get that, and for us to really be successful in doing that, we must have an accurate census count. And so for that, I will conclude with this. There's one major problem, a real bump in the road for an accurate census count. And that is that the Census Bureau is consider putting a citizenship question in the form, asking folks whether or not they are U.S. citizens. Now, given the current environment, which I'm sure you're all aware of, that will drive people underground. People will not, it's almost as Ronald Reagan did. I remember back then, Ronald Reagan did amnesty, right? They talk about the Dreamers being an amnesty program, when in fact they have to wait 8 years with a temporary green card, 5 years with a regular green card, that's 13 years, and then they have to apply for citizenship that could take 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So they could be waiting 15 to 20 years to become a U.S. citizen. Yet some folks want to call that amnesty. Amnesty was what Ronald Reagan did. He says, now you're able to stay in the country and have all the privileges of being a resident of the United States. Please go to your local precinct and get fingerprinted. Nobody went. So he had to take another look at it and get the not-for-profits involved, get the local governments involved, get the churches involved, so people felt comfortable going to the local church or the local non-for-profits, getting fingerprinted so they can apply for amnesty. So if you put the citizenship question on the application, it will send a chilling effect out there, and it will hurt us. A city like New York, which is a very diverse city, which is still maybe over 50% foreign-born, of the sons and daughters of foreign-born people. It will drive them underground. They will not send, they will not respond. They will not open that door to fill out that census form, and we will have a severe undercount. And so that should be the number one fight that we should have. And again, any question that appears on the census form should be appropriately tested. You just can't sort of like off the cuff bring a question to the census form that has not been appropriately researched and tested to understand what the full impact of that question may be. And so this is, the citizenship question is one that just came off all of a sudden, and they want to put that in the census form. And I think it will severely hurt New York City, New York State, and the country. So let's all come together to fight against that. Let's all come together to ensure that we have an accurate census count. Let's all come together for all New Yorkers that will benefit from that. Thank you so much, and keep the faith.
I'm here today to speak with you about the 2020 census. And you see from the title slide, it's getting personal. The reason it's getting personal is because the census affects all of us. I'm a demographer, and I can tell you, obviously I'm a data wonk, and I can tell you that data affects our everyday lives in a major way. The quality of that data is very, very important. The Census Bureau, in many ways, creates reality, a statistical reality that we have to live with for 10 years. The importance of the census, I cannot overstate the importance and the impact that it has on the allocation of resources, the determination of political power. It really defines who we are. When the census is good, we have an accurate representation of reality. When the census is not so good, reality gets distorted. And unfortunately, that distorted reality can be the basis for decisions that maybe are not optimal, that decisions that could be wasteful of resources and frankly not very useful, at least from the standpoint of delivering services to local government, which is what I do. The census, first and foremost, based on the Constitution, is the basis for distributing political power, for the apportionment of seats in the House of Representatives. New York City, New York State that is likely to lose one congressional seat in 2020. Why? Because even though we're growing, even though the state is growing, largely because of New York City, we are not keeping up with population growth in the rest of the country. And because of that, we are likely to lose one seat. But with an undercount, we could lose 2 seats. You go back in history to the 1970s. Between 1970 and 1980, we had a drop of population of about 10% in the city. The state overall lost 5 congressional seats in the 1970s, lost 3 in the 1980s, 2 in the 1990s, and 2 last decade. We are slated to lose 1 now, and like I said, if there's an undercount, we could lose 2. The census is also used to draw political districts, which is the process of redistricting, which has been in the news lately about all kinds of different ways that districts get drawn. But the bottom line is census data is used to draw those districts. And when those districts are drawn based on a good representation of their population, it benefits all of us. But when there's an undercount, we end up with districts that perhaps are too large, because not everybody in those districts, in those areas, that is, those neighborhoods, were counted properly. And finally, there's the allocation of money from the federal government. Every year, the federal government distributes $600 billion, and population plays a role in a number of those programs that are used to deliver services. A lot of the money goes directly to the states, and then the states share the money within. And the distribution of that money within the state is also affected by population. So the allocation of money to the states is crucial. Later on, I'll show you some of the reasons why that's the case. We need to get our fair share, and without an accurate census, that becomes impossible. You need to have an accurate census in order to distribute those dollars fairly, and again, based at least in part on population. Now, what I'm going to provide you with, there are 2 parts to this talk. One part has to do with what I call essential background. The major points that I can provide to you regarding the census, the kind of seminal things you need to know. I asked myself a few weeks ago when I was preparing for this, what 2 or 3 points could I give you that you will hold on to as we all move forward to try to get a more accurate enumeration? The Census Bureau will come after me for this, but the fact is that, I always like to describe the decennial census in 3 easy steps. We print and we send out, if you're the Census Bureau, 143 million pieces of mail, okay, to a list of addresses, and then there are special operations for facilities and places that we call group quarters, with over 8 million people nationwide. And by the way, it takes months and months to print 143 million of anything, right? So the Census Bureau actually starts its printing very soon. Well, next year, they'll start its printing of questionnaires and materials. Then you request that people respond. The expected response rate, or the projected response rate, is 41% online, and then an additional 14% by mail. So that means that 55% will come back within a few weeks. And then the real expensive part starts. Following up on 60 million households. Hundreds of thousands of people are recruited to do this. The first point I want to leave you with is that the decennial census is essentially a census of housing units as well as people. Now, you might ask, New York City exceeded 8 million for the first time in 2000. 2001, the New York Times headline, and here's why. In 1990, the address list was deficient. As I pointed out, we had an under-enumeration of about 240,000 people. The 1990 Address List Improvement Act gave us the ability to look at the addresses, and this is what we did. Take a look at 2000 Lucas submission for the 2000 census. Using a variety of data sets, we gave the Census Bureau 439,000 addresses that they did not have on their list. Okay? Now look at the borough that wins, Queens. 19%, and here's why. Most of these units were in small buildings where units were added legally, illegally. We're agnostic when it comes to this. The Census Bureau did not have these addresses. These are the attics, the basements, and the small multi-unit buildings. The Census Bureau in 2000 was missing 13% of the city's housing stock and 19% of the housing stock in Queens. So we added these in. As a result, we broke the 8 million mark. In 2010, we submitted 197,000 addresses. Only this time, about half of them were in new buildings in the city. The Census Bureau updates its address list twice a year with data from the Postal Service, but they don't always get everything. Our job is to fill in the blanks. So in 2010, the Census Bureau is missing almost 6% of the city's housing units. Again, if you fill out a form, you go to a post office or whatever, you grab a form, a so-called Be Counted form, you fill it out, and you don't have a recognized address, you don't get enumerated. It is very important, again, to leave you with this idea. The address list rules in many ways. Now, 2020, what are we doing? We got our file a short time ago. We have 109 days to go as of today. We got what is called a Luca master address file, 3.6 million addresses. We take this file of these addresses, and what we do is we look at those block by block in the city. We look at areas of the city where we've identified as having a high probability of an undercount, a high probability of missing addresses. We identify what's missing from their list. And again, no address, no questionnaire, and no count. Just some examples of things. This is a building in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, okay, where actually our tax files, which are referred to here as Pluto files, showed 4 units. We had commercial data set that showed 7. We went out into the field and checked, and lo and behold, there were 7 units in this building. In Sunnyside, Queens, this is a very familiar thing. The garage, what used to be the garage in 1950, is now converted. We have residential units in the basement. We have multiple doorbells. These are things you can actually physically see. But we point the Census Bureau to these places and say, look, go look like we did. We've done about 16 months of field work. We've walked about 8%, we, my staff, to be honest, in the interest of full disclosure, we have this health program. They don't need to go to a spa. All they got to do is come to work, and they'll get plenty of exercise. We have walked something like 8 or 9% of the blocks in the city. It's something like 120,000 lots they have actually done field work on. And then Sunset Park, Brooklyn, very common. a basement here. It's a little hard to see, but my staff went out and they talked to the letter carrier. They went down and took a look, and they could see that there was a basement apartment that was converted. These are examples of things that we find. They're out there, and we want people in these units to be enumerated. All right, background item number 2, and this is really true. People don't get this, and we need to get it. The census is an engineering marvel. Hundreds of operations executed in vastly different communities throughout the nation. I point that out because one size does not fit all. You go throughout the nation, they've got a standard set of procedures, they apply those procedures, okay? And it's a very difficult thing to do. And I want to put this to you, I want you to realize this. Identifying and fixing problems is the norm, and timing is everything, okay? Let me give you some illustrations. This is a map of New York City. The Bronx, the only borough connected to the mainland United States. Remember, New York City is a bunch of islands. We always have to keep that in mind when we think about projecting population, for example. These are the local census offices, okay, that were in place in 2010. All right? What this is a map of percent change in vacant housing units. Those of you in the real estate business will find this very interesting. The top category indicates that there are 30 census tracts, this is a tract map of the city, where there was a 500% increase in vacant units. And there were 120 tracts, another 254, with more than 100% increase in vacant units. Look at the cluster in Northwest Queens, look at Southern Brooklyn. All those reds indicate major changes in vacancies. That is, huge increases in vacancies. We get the file at 6:30 in the morning. The Census Bureau gives me the number for New York City. They give us the file. By noon, we told Mayor Bloomberg there was a problem. And the problem that was occurring was that a lot of the units that we added were probably determined by the Census Bureau to be vacant. I want you to think about this. I want you to think about blocks in Astoria, blocks in Bay Ridge, blocks in Bensonhurst, where the number of vacant units would go up by 50 on a single block. That's what the Census Bureau reported. And the real estate industry wanted to know about this because the fact of the matter is that nobody would see this level of vacancy in what are healthy areas. This is indicative of serious problems if this were true. So let me zoom in on Brooklyn. Look at this. Notice something? This is Office 2227, very famous, near to my heart. The fact is something went really wrong in this census office. Okay? All of these vacancies in Bensonhurst, Bay Ridge, Diker Heights, all the way down into Gravesend and Homecrest, even Manhattan Beach. Big increase in vacant units. But notice how it follows the perimeter of the office. Something went wrong. Somebody gave an instruction to call it a day early and say, we're going to call these vacant. I'll tell you, I'm going to follow up in a minute what the Census Bureau is trying to do to deal with this kind of a problem. Another issue, it's another thing that happened. Between 1990 and 2000, the Census Bureau decided to change the Hispanic question. Okay? And in the red, you see the change, the major change they made. They used to say, yes, other Spanish or Hispanic, and underneath, they would give you the exact countries based on national numbers. They would give you some idea of what the numbers look like nationwide, again, determining what shows up on the list. So that's what they did in 1990. In 2000, they decided they were going to drop these examples and just say, yes, other Spanish, Hispanic, or Latino print group, okay? Now, this question was not tested adequately, which the Census Bureau admitted after this happened. In the blue, you have the 1990 reported number of Dominicans in New York, it's about 325,000. This is the number reported in 2000, a little over 400,000. This is the actual revised number that we created with the Census Bureau because the question caused a lot of people not to specify their group. What they did was they wrote in this case, yeah, they wrote in Spanish, Hispanic, or Latino. They followed the examples and wrote that in. And as a result, a lot of the Dominican population was not included in the category Dominican, but in this huge category called unspecified Hispanic. So to be honest, what the Census Bureau said to us after we detected this was, maybe we have the emergence of a pan-Hispanic identity in New York. And my colleague and I looked at and said, no. Have you been to Washington Heights? Have you been to Corona? Talk to community leaders. That is ridiculous. So we took steps with the Census Bureau and we corrected the numbers. But the truth is, when you go ahead and you look at the data that gets produced, between 1990 and 2000, most of the tabulations are for a much lower Dominican number, much lower Ecuadorian number than it should be. Why? Because they didn't test the question adequately. Guess what? 2010, we're back to the specified groups, and in 2020, the same thing. So now, what's the Census Bureau doing to deal with this? A lot of it's encouraging. Response via the internet. There's a big cybersecurity issue. Census Bureau doesn't necessarily know. At this point, they are doing their best to try to put people at ease about security via the internet. But of course, this is the first time they're going to be doing this on a mass scale, so we're very concerned. The item B is tremendous. Real-time tracking of census operations. Can you identify problems as a census is happening? Wouldn't it have been incredible if in Dyker Heights and Bay Ridge, the office, the director of that office, or the regional census director saw the returns coming in with tons of vacants? They would go out immediately. Instead, I'll tell you what happened. We get that result. I go to City Hall. Mayor Bloomberg is briefed on this. He gets on the phone with the Census Bureau director. Census Bureau director says, yes, Mr. Mayor, we're going to look into this. Close to a year later, Census Bureau director comes back and says, yeah, it looks like there was a problem, but we can't do anything about it. I can't go back and recreate April 1, 2010 again. I don't have people. How are we going to do that? We can't do it, Mr. Mayor. So now, we have forced to live with numbers that in some of those communities are too low. How do we know they're too low? Because when you do vital rates, for example, you want to do rates of disease in Astoria or some of those other places I've identified, you find astronomical rates because the base for those rates is understated. You don't have enough people, in other words. In fact, there are a couple of places where we have more incidents of an illness than we have people, okay? So that's a real clue that something's wrong. So we had to help the health department come up with new bases for their vital rates. The Census Bureau can use tracking like UPS, FedEx uses, and hopefully we'll have real-time identification of problems in the field. They want to use admin data, administrative data, postal records to determine whether units are vacant. If you haven't been able to deliver mail to an address for 90 days, then maybe there isn't anyone there. So that's kind of the basis for that. Very controversial. They want to use administrative data to fill in the blanks. If you don't answer your race or Hispanic origin, they want to go back to a previous census to see if you've answered already, and maybe they can associate that response with the current census and fill in the blanks. And then this is an issue that makes me very nervous. Responding on the fly. Now, this is the Census Bureau's story. You're at a basketball game. You got your phone. They put up on the marquee, it's halftime, okay? And you say, you're at a college game, it's halftime. And they say, have you filled out your census form? If not, right now, go to your phone and do it. You don't have your serial number, what you called your case ID number in front of you. So what you do is you just respond, you put your address in, the Census Bureau does a match to the master address file, and you get enumerated. That is the idea behind responding on a fly. Previously, you had to put in your number specifically. In fact, now, if you answer on the internet, they still want you to put in that ID. This is called non-ID processing, essentially. But they want people to be free to answer in any circumstance. Now, final item here for the background. Undercount is not distributed equally by age, race, Hispanic origin, income, or neighborhood. Measures of overall net undercount can be deceptive. I tell you in 2010, the official undercounts for the boroughs of New York City were very, very small, very small. There's no indication of what happened in Brooklyn or what happened in Queens that I showed you earlier. The measures that are used by the Census Bureau overall to depict what's going on are a product of people who are not counted combined with people who've answered the form 3 times. I know that sounds peculiar, but there are people who really get into this, and they answer the form. They get a form by mail, somebody comes to their door, yes, yes, I'll answer, and it's called erroneous enumerations. You look nationwide, there are communities where if there was an adjustment, they'd have to be adjusted down, especially older communities where people, frankly, like to answer the questionnaire. Okay? So what you're getting is a net result. And over the span of the city, those results have different impacts in different neighborhoods. The Demography of Undercount was best summarized by the previous director, Bob Groves, in this Associated Press quote. Overall coverage of the, in this case, 2010 census was exemplary. The traditional hard-to-count groups like renters were counted less well because ethnic and racial minorities, and again, this goes back to Congressman Espaillat's comment, disproportionately live in hard-to-count circumstances. They too are under-enumerated relative to the majority population. That is the story of New York, and you can do it by neighborhood. Now, I don't have a measure of undercount, but this is a good indicator of compliance with the census. These are census mail return rates. So this is the percentage of households that actually returned the questionnaire, responded to the census on their own, so to speak. They were not followed to get a response, and there was no follow-up. So now, what I want to point out to you, something very important. Let's start with a piece of Congressman Espaillat's district up here in the Bronx, going across into Washington Heights, in Central and East Harlem. You'll notice yellow, the two yellows are the highest levels of response, okay? Talking about Hispanic, you're talking about limited English proficient population, you're talking about, again, socioeconomic level, education level, that's not very high, but look at the level of compliance. Central Harlem did not come in well, but Washington Heights, Hamilton Heights, across into Highbridge, and University Heights, down into East Harlem, okay? Hispanic areas have done very well in the census. And I think the Congressman alluded to it earlier when he said, we went out there. This is the effect of outreach. This is the effect of going out and hitting the pavement and having neighbors talk to neighbors, community leaders talk to neighbors about the importance of the census, okay? So this is the South and Central Bronx. Again, high rates. The yellows are higher than average rates of response of, again, returning questionnaires. Look at the East Bronx, lower rates. East Bronx is higher on the socioeconomic scale. What's going on here? You'll notice that there are neighborhoods, black homeowners up to the north in Unionport, Baychester, Williamsbridge did not respond very well. But wait a minute, they're homeowners. A lot of them are homeowners. Why aren't they responding? Southeast Queens, one of the largest black homeowning communities, middle class or upper middle class black homeowning communities in the country. And look, Rosedale, you see lower rates of response, again in the dark brown here. South Ozone Park, lower rates of response. In here we have a big Guyanese population. Well, what's happening there? Look at Brooklyn, Bushwick, Bedford-Stuyvesant, down into Crown Heights, and down Borough Park, down into portions of Bay Ridge and Gravesend, Gerritsen Beach, Canarsie, all lower than average rates. And what I'm trying to point out here is there's no one formula when you tackle outreach, no one formula. And what I'm also pointing out is that outreach does make a difference. This is the question on the 2018 census test in Providence County. I want to point this out because there is a new race question. It may have an impact on the propensity of people to respond, because for the first time, everybody gets to write in. One of the problems we had last time in the census was the Jamaican population would come to me and say, they would say, Mr. Salvo, why should I answer this? If I'm Hispanic, I get to answer who I am, so to speak. If I'm Asian, I get a chance. But what if I'm black and I want to say I'm Jamaican? We didn't have a response. Last time, the option to write in was not available. Now it is. We don't know what impact this is going to have, except I can say that for outreach purposes, it could have a positive impact, and that we're hoping will be the case. Now, where are we headed? Smart outreach for 2020 is what I'm calling it. Creating models with our sister agencies that predict the likelihood of households to mail back their questionnaire. Members of my staff are creating these statistical models that will allow us, we hope, to predict not only how, what areas may be high or low, but why, some of the characteristics of those neighborhoods. and better identifying neighborhoods at risk to undercount in 2020. Why? Because that's the foundation of a census office. The census leader, the outreach coordinator for New York City, which will be named within the next few months, that person will have a toolkit, so to speak, and part of that will be our assessment of areas that that person needs to focus on. Now, the second half, where do we go? We all know this. I don't have to tell you. All you got to do is pick up any newspaper. Even with the budget that the Congressman spoke about, it's still under where we need to be. It's under Secretary Ross's request. Most of the money, or a lot of the money, is going to technology, which is fine, except there's this partnership and outreach campaign that we suspect might be underfunded. Remember that. You know the Census Bureau doesn't have a director or deputy. You know about the climate, the political climate, and about the DOJ request for citizenship. And what we're worried about is federal engagement on the partnership and outreach fronts is likely to be lacking. And at least thus far, we have a problem in terms of outreach to the local communities. The Census Bureau's campaign is national in scope. They're going to have fewer partnership specialists, fewer field offices, fewer staff. Why? Because of that technology piece I told you about. Except there's this little wrinkle in this. They haven't tested adequately some of that technology. All right? They're hoping to do that in this test that's starting now in Providence County, Rhode Island. About 600,000 people. I think it's a little over 250,000 households where they ramp everything up and see how it all comes together. The Census Bureau is going to have fewer resources to deal with the mix of problems we have here in New York. The logistical barriers, the intrusiveness issues. And by the way, I want to separate privacy and intrusiveness issues from the general climate of fear among immigrants. Because there are a lot of people who are not immigrant who are afraid, given what we hear about hacking and the like. Internet access across neighborhoods, even in New York, varies dramatically. And there are some areas, we have a digital divide to some degree in New York too. And of course, there's the fear of the federal government, which from one day to the next, the federal government's full of surprises. This is the key to everything, making the census personal. If we don't, we're not going to make headway. You have to link everyday experiences to the census by way of services people count on to meet essential needs and or enhance their lives as New Yorkers. In other words, you got to really make it personal. And here's some of the ideas behind this. There's a lot of money that comes to the city. Billions of dollars every year, usually through the state. All right? These are some examples of things that people on the ground can relate to. They may not know it's Title I money, but they do know that their school is receiving funds to improve curricula, to essentially try to meet academic standards. They know that. They may not know what the source of funding is, but if that source of funding dries up, those improvements will not be there. Special education grants, there in New York City is something called District 75 with 24,600 students, which have these inclusive programs. Students with disability enrolled in other school districts are eligible to receive support for special education grants. If you have a child that is going for some sort of special education program and you indicate that that could be at risk, that is a serious personal issue. Only then will people be compelled, if they know that might go away, or their children might be impaired. Remember, the number one motivation, native-born or foreign-born, is upward social mobility for children. Your next generation. It drives so much of what we see and makes New York such a special place. It's special because we all want to see, everybody do well, especially our kids. And when you see a threat to kids by way of special education grants, it becomes personal. Who cannot relate to this? $1.6 billion annually to the state for repair, for construction, and repair of bridges and highways. It doesn't get more basic than this. And we have some highlights here. The Gowanus Expressway, Staten Island, Unionport Bridge in the Bronx. There's billions, in this case 1.6 billion. This is annual that comes to the state and that gets distributed to the city for this. very personal. And then one of my favorites, healthcare for children and underserved communities. Health insurance for children, or a so-called S-CHIP program, statewide, this is the number of children. Underserved communities, you go to a community health center for all kinds of services, for your children, especially in this era where health insurance is such an issue, and you get these services at a local community center. How powerful is it when you tell people, I'm sorry, but this program is funded by state money, and that money could go away. We may not have the ability to produce this service. The last illustration here is about businesses. Businesses make avid use of census data. Site location, for market segmentation studies, for citing new stores. There are tools online that use census data for people who are trying to start new businesses and trying to get an idea of what the market might look like for a new business. And we forget that the private sector has a stake in this as well as the nonprofit sector. The private sector has in many ways a major stake because, again, the data from the census and the data from the surveys that rely on the census. This shows below a tool that's actually available which looks at consumer expenditures per household using data that is ultimately calibrated to the census. You can go online and you can research an area where you want to open up shop, for example. Again, think about if these data don't reflect what's actually there. It hurts business, it hurts our economy. Now, how do we help? These are some things that I have pointed out to our City Hall that are very, very important for the Census office once it opens. The Census Bureau wants to use all local networks to hire and recruit locals because if you expect to get a good enumeration in a neighborhood, people in that neighborhood have to tell their neighbors to answer. You have to hire people locally. The Census Bureau may hire 20,000 people to work in New York City in this era of low unemployment. So we want the Census Bureau to have the ability to get a citizenship waiver. Right now, they can only hire citizens. We have to allow them to hire non-citizens. In the past, we've gotten those waivers for a few thousand people. We're hoping that we'll be able to get that again. Why? Language. All the languages that are in the population of the city, all the languages that are out there, we need to be able to address people in their own language to get them essentially to buy into our message. The Complete Count Committee idea, where you pull together community leaders, trusted voices, all of those people need to be able to get out there and endorse the census. One of my kind of dream ideas is to make sure that we engage people like Beyonce to go out and tell their compatriots to answer the census. Think about how powerful that is, okay? I don't have a personal interest in that, but I or Jennifer Lopez up in the Bronx. And you think about this. That's right, Jay-Z. Who said Jay-Z? That's true. You want to get people out there to have the millennials answer. And it's all about engaging community leaders. Here's where it gets really tough. We have to convince community leaders that it's in their interest to tell their constituents that they have to come forward and answer the census and stand up for who they are, because the city needs for them to do that, and they personally have a stake in it. Just to give you, and again, I apologize if your organization's not up here, these are some of the 2010 census partners that we had as part of the initiatives in the city. Those partners are going to be more critical than ever this time around. And this is a very recent quote from an article that I want to end on. Our people, they don't know what it is, this census questionnaire. They don't understand its importance, and they would rather be left alone. This is our nightmare. This is what we're going to have to deal with. And unless we make it personal, we're not going to be able to overcome this, especially in the current environment. So the theme going forward is to try to engage people at a very personal level to get those messages across to people that it's very important to answer the census. I want to thank all of you for attending today. I know it's early, and I appreciate it very much, and I will look forward, in my role, working with many or all of you in pursuit of a good census. Thank you very much.